Before we begin, I'm certain that people will be very dismissive of this video's concept, considering Star Rail is rarely associated with the term skill. And with the existence of the auto battle button, I honestly couldn't blame people for thinking this way, as it gives people a solid reason to ignore learning how characters work. However, the truth is that skill has a very large role to play in this game, and could be the defining factor that stops you from getting faster clears. But it's important to recognize that players' skill looks very different in Star Rail than other games, especially for the many players who came from Genshin. And although it asks a different set of skills than you may be used to, there's still far more depth in its mechanics than you'd initially think. So then, let's get a rundown of what player skill looks like in HSR. Well, it's important to state the obvious that HSR isn't a very mechanically demanding game. And when I say that, I'm referring to the term mechanical skill, which basically involves things like your precision, speed, or ability to execute the correct inputs. For those who play the other Hoyo games, mechanical skill is prominent in all of them, and is an extremely important skill to master. However, for HSR, or almost any turn-based RPG, the focus has shifted much more towards game sense. This term often involves things like resource management, pre-planning future moves, and understanding matchups. All these concepts, especially resource management, are very important in Star Rail, and are the difference between the crazy clears you see from showcases and the clears that you can do on your account. Now, these two terms are commonly used in the gaming sphere, more notably in the shooter genre, but hold high significance in HSR, considering its nature as a gacha game. I say this because there are very few factors that are fully in your control, whether it be relics, pulls, or enemy RNG. But player skill, and knowledge of the mechanics you're using, are entirely in your control. It's for this reason that we can both have the same characters, with the same stats, and same investment, yet one person can clear far faster than the other. Whether for better or for worse, the gap between someone who knows what they're doing and someone who doesn't will always exist. But player skill isn't something that affects everyone equally, as many characters gain more from it than others. This fact is very important, as some players are unwilling to invest their time into learning a character, while others may only find enjoyment in pushing their limits. So recognizing which characters fall under each category could be pivotal in your pull plans. With that in mind, I want to make things very clear that every character in this game will perform better if you know what you're doing. So whether I list the characters gaining more from player skill or not, the truth is that you'll always perform better than auto battle, if you understand the character. This is the case because there are far too many factors that auto battle can't account for. Most notably, foresight. Now, resource management is a very big part of this game, and auto battle simply can't account for the situations where you'd overkill, or when you'd prefer to save resources for the next wave. It's for this reason that I view auto battle only runs very similarly to no limited Eidolon runs, as they're both self-imposed challenges. And while I hold immense respect for those who play that way, it's important to recognize that these are challenges, which are done to intentionally make the game harder. I'm putting extra emphasis on this point to encourage you to learn how your teams work, and to avoid defaulting to auto battle when you engage with endgame. So let's start categorizing characters, and delve deeper into how skill impacts them, starting with those whom I define as low impact. Now, I'd like to preface this by saying that it's impossible to delve into all of the nuance for each team in one video. And while I have plans on more comp-specific videos in the future, this one will be far more broad. With that in mind, let's get into the comp that most people immediately think of when you consider a team requiring low skill: Casterus. Now, the funny thing with Mono Remembrance as an archetype is that there's a lot of small adjustments you can make in your gameplay to elevate its heights, but the floor of its performance is high enough to ignore these optimizations. This is especially the case for Casterus' rendition of Mono Remembrance, as much of her kit essentially plays itself. The gameplay loop of blowing up Evi, healing with Hyacinth, farming Cyreni's Recollection stacks, and blowing up Netherwing is very streamlined, with few opportunities to really mess it up. It's for this reason that I've seen many people almost exclusively play this team on auto battle, and I truthfully can't blame you for doing so. But I'd like to reiterate that you lose a fair share of the team's strength when you do this for a multitude of reasons. Firstly, I cannot overstate how important it is to use your resources effectively in this team, as one misplay could cost you a cast result. Little things like saving a Hyacinth ult to use once Evi is summoned, letting Evi act before it reaches 16 Memoria stacks, and summoning Netherwing before Casterus' turn, 90-0, can all lead to that last new bud needed for a final ult. Then there's the additional fact of Auto Battle being exceptionally terrible at playing Evernight and managing her Darkest Riddle state. This is because at E0, Evernight's ultimate state only lasts 2 turns, and actually requires you to look ahead in the turn order to squeeze out as much energy as possible if you want to keep 100% uptime. And Auto Battle is incapable of doing everything I just stated, which leaves you with low uptime in the state where almost all of her buffs and damage come from. This is all a very long-winded way of saying that Modern Remembrance actually has far more ways to optimize your gameplay than many people think. But at the same time, if you were forced to play a team on Auto Battle, this team would likely lose the least from doing so. But recently, we've gotten a new contender for that spot, and that would be Superwolf's rendition of the Elation team. Now the 3-man core of Superwolf, Yaoguang, and Sparksy seems to be the intended team for Superwolf for now, and that's quite clear to see through their gameplay loop. First, you've got Sparksy, an SP-intensive sub-DPS that can generate a large amount of punchline. Then you've got Yaoguang, a team-wide Elation support that's SP positive and forces an AHA instance. And lastly, there's Superwolf, an SP positive main DPS that relies on punchline generation and AHA instances from those 2 characters to acquire and maintain her ultimate. While some aspects of these kits may feel a little clunky, predominantly Sparksy's lack of speed, the overall flow remains streamlined, akin to Modern Remembrance. But those similarities end there, as Superwolf is in a unique situation where she actually gains a lot from player skill. And while Cast vs gameplay does have many small adjustments available, the impact the optimization has on Superwolf is far more significant. For instance, saving punchline generating abilities like Yaoguang and Sparksy's ultimates to use immediately after Superwolf exits her ultimate could translate to 1 more enhanced basic attack in a cycle that you wouldn't have gotten otherwise. Then there's the importance of getting Superwolf's extension by clearing a wave during the middle of her basic attack. This one is more important than you may think, because when you do this, your buffs will get extended by an additional turn, which is extremely important when using EMC as a replacement to Sparksy. And lastly, you've got the importance of maintaining a high amount of certified banger, as it's one of the biggest contributing factors to her enhanced basic attacks. This is only scratching the surface, as resource management is arguably the most important within Elation comps, by nature of the multiple different resources they must balance. And amongst all of the Elation teams thus far, Superwolf gains the most from abusing these mechanics to their limit, and correctly rationing their damage between waves. So you must be wondering, why would I list Superwolf in the low impact category? And the answer stems from one concept: how high her skill floor is. Now, as I alluded to in the caster segment, the skill ceiling for most characters in this game are far higher than many people believe. That is predominantly why I recommend people to learn their characters instead of relying on Auto Battle. But for the characters that have an insanely high skill floor, the need for optimization lowers dramatically. And as we established, Superwolf happens to be one of the DPS with the highest skill floor, which bears a greater importance than her additionally high skill ceiling. So while Superwolf has a high skill floor and ceiling, I'd still place her in this category, since you're not exactly pushed to reach her limits yet. Though I would heavily recommend Superwolf owners to eventually learn some of the optimizations in her gameplay. But with that out of the way, I think it's important we shift our attention to characters who are highly impacted by player skill. Now, in my previous video, I spoke about a few examples of characters that fall under this category, notably Cyrenian and Axa. So I'll talk a little more about some other characters this time, with the first one being Fei Xiao. Now, I'm uncertain how many people have pulled on Fei Xiao's current rerun, but if you are, then it's important to understand that Fei Xiao is one of those characters that is entirely different in the right hands. I say this because before Nova Flares, Fei Xiao was by far the best aging 2.x carry, but this is under the strict condition that you can play her well. This is because Fei Xiao and her composition has some of the highest skill ceilings in the game, and has managed to benefit from many newer supports that have been released. Characters like RMC, Tribby, Ashvale, and Blade have all expanded her shelf life in one way or another, but all of this skill stems from one part of her kit, her ultimate. Now, Fei Xiao is a DPS that both wants high attack frequency and has high attack frequency herself. Because of this, her supports either contributes to or benefits from this aspect of her kit, and her high synergy with certain characters is what allows so much skill expression. This point cannot be illustrated better than with one of her best in slot supports, Moza. Now, on paper, Moza may not seem all too special, especially considering his lackluster damage amp for today's standards. However, he continues to shine in Fei Xiao teams because of his high attack frequency and his ability to utilize Wind Set. Weirdly enough, even though Moza enters the Departed state, which quite literally removes him from the field, he can still utilize the action advance from Wind Set. With this, his attack frequency ends up being far higher than numbers will reflect, which results in a lot of Fei Xiao ults. This synergy becomes even more notable once Fei Xiao is E2, as stack generation becomes trivial when she's paired with him. With all this in mind, optimized Fei Xiao starts to resemble Aglaea gameplay, as you take a death by 1,000 cuts approach through ultimate spamming. Furthermore, this attack frequency benefits the upcoming Blade quite a lot, as it'll result in even more Blade follow-ups, which translates to more Fei Xiao ults. This all leads to the team feeling very fluid, and is arguably the most satisfying composition to play. But on the other hand, an important thing to realize with Fei Xiao, or almost any high skill character in this game, is that their difference with a sustain and without one is very big. Now this can be mitigated for the few E2 dipped owners out there, as he's a very strong support for every attack skiller at that level, especially for Fei Xiao. But any other sustain will struggle, and this is extremely noticeable with her. With that being said, Fei Xiao's high synergy with a multitude of strong supports makes her a character that's rarely lacking options for that last slot. This is both her blessing and her curse, as much of her strength is locked behind a playstyle that many people are unwilling to engage with: sustainless. But for the Fei Xiao enjoyers out there, I want you to understand that she is a strong DPS in the right hands, especially with the upcoming Blade. But it's possible those hands may never be yours. On that note, another character that suffers from a similar fate is the recently Nova Flared Zila. Now for a long time prior to the Nova Flare, you'd see a Zila Zero Cycle done by masochists that were willing to reset hundreds of times for a perfect clear. But after the Nova Flare, I'd say that Zila has reached a point where getting solid clears has become far more doable by the average player. But I've not discussed Zila's Nova Flare directly on this channel yet, so let's take some time to describe things. Well, to give a brief TLDR, beyond increasing Zila's motion values up to the level of modern DPS, they've buffed some of her Eidolons and allowed her to do an additional skill when Zila attacks an enemy under 50% HP. It's important to note that this additional skill cannot provide energy or consume SP, but it can proc Resurgence. This one change not only elevates Zila's baseline performance, but also allows even more skill expression. Getting as many additional skills as possible, allocating your damage correctly between each target, and obtaining Resurgence procs at pivotal times, while also being mindful not to waste kills that could have resulted in a future Resurgence, are all just one of the many parts of her gameplay. However, while the Nova Flare elevated her to a very high level, it also highlighted her biggest weakness: matchup dependence. Now Zila is a character that will perform incredibly well in AoE scenarios, but will perform horribly in single target fights. As such, understanding how and when to play her are both very important. With all of that being said, I'd like to reiterate that Zila is actually a very strong character after her Nova Flare, and is quite accessible considering you can lose a 50-50 to her, but this strength is ultimately locked behind skill, with very few workarounds. But that actually brings up a very interesting question. Can the importance of skill be mitigated? Now this question is a bit odd, but I acknowledge that there are a few people out there who refuse to put their time into learning a team, so I prefer to cover all my bases. For those people, I'd say that you can mitigate the need for skill in some teams, but how you'd go about doing so may not be what you want to hear. But the truth is that the most efficient way to cut down the need for skill is by vertically investing in them. Doing so will increase the floor of your performance high enough to reach your desired clear speeds. But the investment required to mitigate it could be very large, and there are a few instances where even those investments may not be enough to bridge the gap. So then, I'll show a list of characters that I've tested and explain some of these scenarios. But with the list, you can see I've split some DPS on whether they'd fall under low or high impact from skill expression. And you may notice some patterns. For one, many of the main push characters fall under the low impact tier, and almost every hunt character is placed in the high impact tier. Now for those who are interested in playing a high impact character, but have no interest in learning how to optimize them, there's often a very early Eidolon that can mitigate things. For example, Archer E1 is extremely strong numerically, but it also helps in streamlining his gameplay loop. This is the case because with Archer E1, your turns essentially boil down to either press skill 3 times or press skill 5 times, depending on whether you have Sparkle ult. Because of this, much of the nuance with SP management is thrown completely out the window, arguably dropping him down to low impact. Aglaia and Evernight are in a similar situation, where their uptime problems essentially vanish as soon as you acquire their E1 and E2 respectively. This isn't to say that they lose all skill expression entirely, as I'd actually argue Evernight E2 increases her skill ceiling quite a lot, but we're more focused on their skill floor being raised. With all of this in mind, I want to be very clear that I am not advocating for you to do this, as I've actively been doing quite the opposite for this entire video. But I'm aware that sometimes people just want to play the game and get the rewards with minimal effort, and the last thing they want to do is spend countless hours learning a character. So let's address the final question of this video. Does skill matter in HSR? To that I'd say, don't let the previous segment fool you. Skill matters a lot in this game, far more than people are willing to admit. However, skill isn't the only factor that impacts your clear speed, and its impact varies a lot depending on who we're talking about. If you're someone who mains Fei Xiao, then yes, getting better at playing her will be more impactful than any Eidolon could compare to. However, if you're someone who mains Castris, while the benefits are there, you're not punished severely for ignoring it. Either way, understanding the nuance between player skill and its impact on your characters is very important. But I've also made it clear that things can change if you don't want to make these optimizations, and I hold no judgment for people who choose to do so. So here's the more important question. Are you willing to learn? I hope that I covered all the important parts of this concept, as this video ended up being far harder to make than I anticipated. And I could already see people disagreeing with Superwolf's placement, among other things. And I can see the arguments as to why, but I'd like to re-emphasize we're focusing on her skill floor, not ceiling. Either way, it's just my opinion, so feel free to drop your own in the comments. Also, for people out there that's curious about how to get better with the teams I didn't mention, I'd highly recommend you check out theherder.com, otherwise known as the Genius Archive. It's basically an online leaderboard where people post the best clears for each character in the latest endgame rotations. I found it to be a very useful tool to just watch some of the best clears, and try to pick out some of the tactics they use, then implement them in my gameplay. I'll link in the description for those who are interested. Anyways though, bye bye!